What do you do when you don't know what to do? When the pathway forward doesn't seem clear, when there is no obvious answer, what do you do? I suppose you have some choices. You could ask someone for wisdom or input. You could find a close friend or a trusted advisor, and you could share with them the predicament or the choices before you, and you could allow them to give you input. You could post online and ask if someone has wisdom that would benefit you in the situation you're in. Or you could forget all of that altogether, and you could assume that in somehow, some way, you can just go it alone, and it will eventually work itself out. What do you do when you don't know what to do? Each of us make that decision on a regular basis. Where will we get wisdom? Where will we find advice? How will we decide how we get from here to there? If you knew that scrolling through social media would undoubtedly give you the answer you needed, you would go there for sure. If you knew that one person in your contacts could give you that information every time, you would go there for sure. So today, I want to introduce you to a new idea, a new concept maybe, about how you find the answer when you don't know what to do. And the answer is wrapped up in this word, and the word is trust. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the 23rd Psalm, and we're going to see what the Psalm might teach us about where we go when we don't know what to do. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the 23rd Psalm, or maybe even more pointedly, you have read the Bible before and you found it to be altogether unhelpful. It was confusing, it didn't make sense, you weren't sure what to do with it. Today, I believe that this passage we're going to read is a message for you, because it gives you direct input into how you answer that question. What do I do when I don't know what to do? Because it encourages us to place our trust in God, to place our trust in something greater than ourselves, which is not a guarantee that things will be easy, but it is a guarantee that you will not go through it alone. So the words you hear today are beautiful. They roll off the tongue, they sink in your hearts, they're memorable. You'll be thinking about them long after we wrap up our time together today. But underneath the surface is an idea about the way that we live that can transform the way that we approach our lives. So today, I just want to start by reading the 23rd Psalm to you. Today, I'm reading out of a Bible I don't normally use. This Bible is on the bookshelf in my office. I literally had to dust it off when I pulled it off the shelf. This Bible is the King James Version of the Bible. It was written in about 1611, authorized by King James in England, and it's a little bit hard to understand. This Bible in particular belonged to my grandpa. Has his name on the front, and thank God his eyes were not good, and it is also large print. So I can read it to you without any difficulty today. This is what the 23rd Psalm says. This is King David writing. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And as beautiful as those words are, they're far more than words. They're a guarantee of what your life can look like when you trust God. Today we're wrapping up a series going through the book of Psalms. If you haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Ryan, and it's my privilege to bring us to this conclusion. Through this series, we've looked at 5 of the 150 Psalms, which means that we've left you 145 to study on your own, and I hope you're doing that. Because what the Psalms do is something unique in the way that it speaks to our hearts. It gives us words, it gives us language to say back to God about who God is and what God has done. When you're feeling anxious or overwhelmed, there's a psalm that can help you express that from your heart. If you're feeling elated and overjoyed, there's a psalm that can help you express that. If you're questioning or doubting or whatever it might be, the Psalms give words to the cries of our heart. And so my hope is that you've been digging into and reading these Psalms along the way. And the other thing the Psalms do is they help us prepare our hearts for moments in our lives. In about 10 days, we're going to have an election in this country. And my hope, my prayer is that the conversations we've had through the book of Psalms have prepared your heart for what is to come. And my prayer for you is that as you have internalized the messages that we've been sharing, the dialogue that's been going on about election cycles and voting, that it has prepared you to be sure that on the other side of the election, that your relationships and your faith are intact. So as a quick reminder for all of those things, we're going to bridge the gap from Psalms to where we're going next with a special one-off message next week called Make Every Effort, where we will remind ourselves of everything we've learned to this point this year about putting our trust in God and loving our neighbors in the way that we would want to be loved. And I believe that this message today is a great start to get us there, because the 23rd Psalm is a reminder to us. In fact, it assures us that God's presence is a promise. God's presence is a promise to us. Now, you know, if you're going into an unfamiliar situation, it sometimes feels good to have a buddy. Is that why girls go to bathroom in packs? I don't know. Like, you just take a buddy with you, and everything is better when you have a buddy with you. So last week, I went out to dinner, and I took a huge risk. I had barbecue outside of Kansas City, okay? So I knew it was a risk when I went. I knew I was rolling the dice, but I made the decision to go ahead and go anyway. And I went with a friend. His name was John. In fact, Micah went with me as well. So we go to barbecue with John, and he picks the very best barbecue restaurant in his entire city, which meant that we had to cross the state line from Augusta, Georgia, to North Augusta, South Carolina. We cross the river, we find the barbecue restaurant, and we pull into the parking lot, and I see this, and I am overjoyed. Barbecue Barn looks like it's going to have good food, doesn't it? I mean, the parking lot is gravel. This is going to be amazing. And so we pull in the parking lot, and we get out of his car, and we begin to admire the sign and take it all in, and I'm taking pictures, and we're going to walk to the building. And before we get there, he gets kind of this really serious tone, and he says, "Hey, guys, I just want to remind you, don't order beef because you're not in Kansas City anymore." And I appreciated that reminder. I needed that maybe as just a little nudge to me as we went. And so we went inside and we walked up to the register to place an order. The best barbecue places, you order before you sit down. You guys know this. I've told you this before. And as we began to look at the menu, he let me know what I was eating. And I appreciated that. He was my confidant, my partner, my friend. And he said, "You're having barbecue." And I was like, "No joke, bro. We're in a barbecue restaurant." Yes, I'm having barbecue. And I learned in that moment that there are two things that barbecue means. Generally, it means barbecue, the way that you would anticipate that it would mean. Smoked meats, grilled meats, that kind of stuff. But also, in South Carolina, it's a very specific term meaning pulled pork. And so he placed our order for us. A large barbecue plate with a side of mac and cheese and a side of hash and rice. Now, don't get me wrong. I would have ordered the mac and cheese, but the hash and rice did not sound good. It did not look good. You can see it here on the top right. Like, what is the gruel that we're eating here? This was not my idea of good barbecue, but I had a friend and I trusted him. And so I sat down and I began to eat. And after I consumed those delightful cornbread things that had been fried and placed on top of my meat, I enjoyed everything else on the plate, including the hash and rice. See, I knew enough to know not to order burnt-ends in South Carolina. I knew enough to know that you should always get mac and cheese in the South. I knew that sweet tea was the thing. I knew all of this. But what I didn't know was that the hash and rice would change my life. Barbecue trimmings, pork fat, and potatoes blended to a beautiful, pure consistency and placed on top of rice, and you have Southern-style barbecue. I never would have ordered it, but I had a faithful friend. God's presence in our life is similar to going to barbecue with a friend. When you show up and God is on your side, God is with you and near you, and you're communicating, it changes the way you interact. It changes the way that you view the world. God's presence is a promise. God's presence is a promise that you're never going to be alone. God's presence is a promise that you're never going to be forgotten. God's presence is a promise that no matter how difficult your current situation is, you will not be in it forever. God's presence is a promise that your brokenness will not be the end. And maybe today you walked in the doors and the promise of that kind of a relationship is exactly what you've needed. And when you place your trust in God, that is the promise that you receive. So today we're going to take a closer look at Psalm 23, and we're going to unpack how we find God's presence in the midst of this promise. And before we do, let me just say a quick word. My study for this message was deeply influenced by East African agriculturalist and shepherd W. Philip Keller. He wrote a book titled A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23, where he takes his own life experiences as a shepherd and bumps them up against the biblical text and helps us see and understand what it is that David might have been writing about 3,000 years ago. And so today, I just want to share with you a few insights about what Psalm 23 is saying to us. And so let's jump in. Psalm 23:1 tells us the shepherd provides. Psalm 23:1 says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." The imagery begins with the idea of a shepherd and a sheep. Now, shepherds are not the most highly educated, highly sought after people in the community. In fact, they're outcast. They have a dirty, stinky job that most people didn't want. You don't aspire to be a shepherd necessarily, but someone has to do it. And so the shepherds are not the highest class of people that there are. It's lonely to be a shepherd. And then you have the sheep that are not the smartest animals in the world. They're utterly dependent on this lonely shepherd to provide for them, to guide them. Sheep literally have no natural defense mechanism, which means that if they get scared and they run, they may find themselves tangled up in a bramble of vines and they will die there because they cannot escape. They will run into danger because they cannot protect themselves from the danger that is directly in front of them. They need help finding food and water. They need to be protected. The sheep are utterly dependent on the shepherd. Sheep are dumb and sheep stink. Now, most people don't compare themselves to sheep. I heard a pastor friend say one time, you don't tell your son you're as strong as a sheep, or your daughter you're as smart as a sheep. That's more of an insult than a compliment. So this is where it gets a little weird. In this story, you are a sheep. Can you turn to someone around you and say, you are a sheep? You are a sheep. We've received this promise that God isn't some distant, far-off figure, but instead He's a shepherd who loves and cares for us deeply. He's our personal guide and our personal provider. Being a sheep, a dirty, stinky, dumb sheep, is not the worst thing because it reminds us to be dependent on the shepherd. And when we depend on the shepherd, we have everything we need. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. Theologian Dallas Willard wrote it this way: the life without lack is known by those who have learned how to trust God in the moment of their need. And when you trust God, you see that God provides. The second thing I want to point out from Psalm 23 is that the shepherd refreshes. Psalm 23, verse 2, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. So what do you do when you don't know what to do? Sometimes you just need to pause. The scripture tells us that the shepherd makes the sheep lie down. I was in the coffee shop between services, and there's a gentleman who had been in the chapel service at 9 o'clock, and he said, I used to live in North Dakota, and I was a banker, and we had to go out and count the sheep to be sure they had what they said they were going to have. And he said, you know the smartest thing my wife ever did? She made me take off my clothes before I came in the house because the sheep smelled so awful, and I spent my whole day up close and personal with these sheep trying to make sure that they got what they needed to get. So they captured them, and they sheared them, and they took care of them. And because the sheep wouldn't drink in fast-moving waters, they would dam up the waters or create pools of water for them to drink in. And you and I are not that different from sheep. Sometimes we need to be made to slow down. We need to be made to lie down. Have you ever been so busy that when you got done doing all the things you were busy doing, that your body just stopped and you found yourself sick? That would be December 25th almost every year for me. It's so busy leading up to Christmas, and on December 25th, I'm like, I can't move, I can't do anything. My body is saying it's time to stop, it's time to slow down. This is biblical stuff. You may remember the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 18 and 19. He's in the wilderness, and he's had enough, and he just says to God, he says, I'm over it, I'm ready to be done living this life. You know what God does? God says, go take a nap. And when he wakes up from his nap, an angel is there and provides him with some food. And when he wakes up, he goes back to sleep and he wakes up, he's a different person. Why? Because he had a snack and a nap. We are all toddlers at heart, folks. There's nothing that a little bit of sleep and a little bit of food can't cure in our lives. This is a biblical concept. The sheep are being refreshed by their shepherd. Number 3, the shepherd guides. Chapter 23, verse 3. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. I just want to say real briefly here that the shepherd is leading the sheep towards new pastures, towards safe pastures, towards new food. All of that stuff is true. And you want to know the most important thing for a shepherd is that they end with the same number of sheep that they began with. Losing even one is too many, which is why there's the story in Scripture about Jesus leaving the 99 to go and find the one. Having that one is so incredibly important. So the shepherd guiding is not to guide us so that we can't have fun or do what we want or whatever it might be. The shepherd guides us to keep us safe and to keep us together. And as sheep, we listen closely for the shepherd's voice and we follow him where we're told to go. And we follow him where we're called. And when we do, we find ourselves arriving where it is that we wanted to go. And here's where it gets really good. Number 4, the shepherd shepherds. Verse 4, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. If you've been to Hobby Lobby recently, you probably saw this overlaid on some picture of the ocean or something. Or maybe you went to a funeral recently and it was printed in the program, or the pastor used this verse in some way. And this is a promise worth remembering because it reminds us of God's presence in our lives, even in the most difficult situations that we find ourselves in. The shepherd shepherds. And that is to say that the shepherd is always there. In the moments that we feel like we're alone, the shepherd is nearby, keeping watch. In the moments where we need to be prodded along to keep going towards where we're going, the shepherd is nudging us to get us there. When we wander off path, the shepherd isn't watching us wander and hoping we come back. He's using his staff to lovingly bring us back into the fold. And you may have your own story about how you've experienced the reality of this in your life. Or maybe today you just walked in longing for this type of loving care that only God can offer. Well, last Sunday we had a guest speaker. If you've been around for a while, you probably recognized him. It was Jim Preissig, who's our pastor emeritus. I say he's a guest speaker because he's only spoke here more than anyone else in the history of the church, right? And so Pastor Jim so graciously agreed to be here last Sunday so I could be gone. Now, let me tell you what my week looked like last week. Last week, I got on an airplane at 4 o'clock on Saturday morning, and I flew to Atlanta, Georgia, and got in a rental car. That was a story for another day, and made my way to Augusta, Georgia. Augusta, Georgia is about 120 miles from Atlanta and also 120 miles from Charleston, which is where the Hurricane Helene, made landfall. And so I was going to Atlanta for a conference for pastors, and I thought, what if I fly down early and go and I work to help the church that we're associated with in Augusta do a little bit of cleanup work? And so that's exactly what we did. Micah and I left early. The other people followed after us on Sunday. And we got down to Augusta, and we went and we worked with the church that is located there. And the pastor, friend of mine, his name is John. He's the guy who thanked us with barbecue. Praise God. He knows how to show hospitality. He's the pastor of Quest Church in Augusta, Georgia. We took an offering for them a few weeks ago. You guys gave $5,000 to assist them in their cleanup efforts. And they're doing two things as they clean up in the community. Number one, they are paying local contractors to clean up messes in people's yards, to take trees off houses, to take down trees where there's power lines, that kind of thing. But they're also sending crews out into the city. And so when Micah and I arrived, we were privileged to meet up with John and his team at a house right in their community. And the house came to their attention because of something really unique that happened. Now, as you drive through North Augusta and Augusta, you find piles of debris that look about like these. They're 10, 12 feet high. They go for block after block. Trees have fallen on houses and cars and businesses and power lines. It is just a disaster everywhere you look down in Augusta. But there was this one house that in the midst of all of this chaos had displayed a little bit of hope. And this sign was hanging on their fence. The pastor drove by a few times and noticed the sign, and he decided he wanted to see who lived there. He wanted to have a conversation with them. I think it's kind of like, there's somebody I need to know. That's an interesting viewpoint. So he knocked on the door, and an elderly lady answered. She was a widow, and as it turned out, there was a tree blocking her front door in such a way that she could not navigate past it. And there was a tree blocking her driveway so that she couldn't go in and out of her driveway. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, she reminds the people around her of God's blessings in their life. This is a person who truly understands that even in the darkest moments, that the presence of God stays with us. When Micah and I arrived, this is what her driveway looked like. You could not get where you were going. That tree that starts on the left went all the way across to the right into the neighbor's yard, and we had the privilege of cutting up these stumps into huge chunks and lugging them out to the street where they're going to be picked up at some point. And after a day of hard work, this is what the driveway looked like. This woman who knew already that she was blessed in an even more profound way because she can now access her car and she can now leave her driveway. And the back to normal and the cleanup can truly begin in her life. Even in the darkest valleys, God's presence is with us. How do I know that's true? Because God's presence is a promise. It's a promise that's fulfilled in the person of Jesus, who Jesus is and what he's done. In fact, Jesus identifies himself as a shepherd. This analogy from Psalm 23 pulls its way all the way through to John chapter 10, where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. We are sheep in constant need of a shepherd, in constant need of reminders to draw us back in to the shepherd that loves us so deeply and wants nothing more than to have a relationship with us, to walk through the darkest valleys with us, to guide us when we get off track, and to lovingly care for us, making us to lie down in green pastures and to drink from the quiet waters. And so I wonder today, how are you with the Good Shepherd? Have you said yes to trusting in him? What do you do when you don't know what to do? Is praying or seeking God's wisdom at the top of the list, or is it somewhere closer to the bottom? Even in the darkest valleys, God's presence remains.